Last week was the wildest preseason we've ever seen. Arms Warriors and Frost DKs were one-shotting people left and right, while Mistweaver Monks were lighting up the arena like Ash's Pikachu. And now, after the first wave of PvP tuning, we're here to break down the changes and let you know what to expect in the first week of the new season. First up, there was one change that affects everyone in PvP. The Gladiator's Distinction bonus from equipping 2 PvP trinkets has been buffed, and now everyone will have 5% more stamina in PvP. This isn't the first time Blizzard has made a change like this, but typically the goal is to slow the game down by giving everyone slightly bigger health pools. And if you are one of our smartest skill cap viewers, you already know that stamina buffs directly buff classes like Warlocks and DKs while nerfing sub-rogues slightly, and even buffing some defensives like Touch of Karma. And if this is information you didn't know, then you need to check out our courses on how to counter every class in PvP. We've also got the best positioning guides on the internet, and our famous class courses which teach you how to master your spec. We take concepts and break them down into bite-sized pieces, kinda like quests, but instead of experience, you gain rating. We've also upgraded our UI in Season 2 with brand new features including in-game BIS lists, and now complete 2-in-1 hot swapping between PvP and PvE. As always, we're continuing to offer our rank up guarantee where we literally promise you will gain rating by using our service. Be sure to click the link below to get started with an exclusive discount for Season 2. For now, back to the video. Now let's take a deeper dive into the melee who are getting changes this week. First up, we have a nerf to the Frost DK gimmick you probably died to at least once this week. The new Death's Cold Embrace PvP talent, which previously buffed Remorseless Winter by 750% during Pillar of Frost, has been nearly cut in half. Will Frost DKs still do a lot of burst? Yes, of course, but now it's going to be slightly more manageable, especially considering this talent makes the DK move incredibly slow, allowing for some potential counterplay for a few classes. Next up is Demon Hunter, who are seeing some minor changes to their hero spec, as well as a buff to their 2 set, which some players will be able to get this week by hitting 1600. Anyway, despite these changes, we've actually been pretty impressed with DH so far. Even though the preseason has been super chaotic, the 11.1 damage buffs seem to be paying off for everyone's favorite Demon Daddy cosplayers. DH damage is absurd at the moment and will scale super well in the early season. And with buffs to the PvP trinket set bonus and nerfs to other high tier melee, we think DH will have enough survivability to be in a really good spot for week 1. Speaking of high tier melee getting nerfed, Feral Druid is getting some minor blows to its burst thanks to a small hit to Ferocious Bite and Incarnation. Despite this, we still think that they will be one of the better melee in week 1. Not to spoil too much, but some of Feral's natural predators are getting nerfed, and more importantly, some casters are getting buffs. Since Feral is essentially Rogue version 2 at this point, buffs to casters are always a good thing. And even though Cyclone was nerfed in 11.1, this is less of a hit to Feral compared to Boomy and Resto. As long as the meta slows down a bit, Feral should be in a really good spot. The next melee on the chopping block was Windwalker Monk, who got a premature nerf to the new Plunderstorm ability, Slicing Winds, which now deals 20% less damage in PvP. Overall though, this is probably a drop in the bucket, considering the Windwalker toolkit was the bigger carry in the preseason. Monks are doing exceptionally well in those blender melee lobbies, and now that Holy Paladin is off the menu, we expect Monks to have a really good week 1. And if there's still one spec we could see being sleeper OP this week, it's Assassination Rogue, who are getting a 4% overall damage buff, which isn't crazy, but keep in mind virtually every other melee will be getting nerfs. As we mentioned earlier, there are also some casters getting really big buffs this week, which is always a good sign for Asa Rogues. Sub, on the other hand, is actually getting a small nerf to Secret Tech, but this might not be the biggest change. Remember that health pools are also going up while Sub is losing its Season 1 tier set, and as the cherry on top, players will probably be running around with more versatility than normal during the first few weeks of the season. Overall, we expect Sub to be the worst rogue spec, and potentially one of the worst specs in the game for the average player. Enhancement Shaman is getting some PvE focused nerfs this week, which really shouldn't affect PvP. Enhance is always a bit tricky. During the preseason, they were hitting absurdly hard with their 1-minute Doom Winds burst. Does that make them good? Of course, but broken? Probably not. It's kind of like the Frost DK problem. Once you understand the gimmick and know how to play around it, Enhance really isn't that big of a deal. We expect players like Big Dam to do well in Season 2, but the spec overall will continue to be chained to its damage output. If Enhance is pumping, it's going to be good, but any damage nerfs could move it down to the mid-tiers. Speaking of pumping, Arms Warriors are getting some expected nerfs this week, with Mortal Strike, Execute, and Demolish all being nerfed in PvP. Now, keep in mind that all these spells were buffed in the pre-patch, especially MS, which had a 66% increase. We still think Arms Warrior will be super strong, but not nearly as oppressive as it was in the preseason. Despite doing insane numbers, Warriors are still really good kill targets. Now that they pose less of a damage threat, it should be easier for many classes to apply much needed counter pressure. Fury Warrior is also seeing some nerfs too, with Rampage and Blade Storm both being nerfed in PvP. We're guessing you probably didn't see many Fury Warriors last week, but they were actually flying under the radar, simply being overshadowed by Arms. Remember that Fury got a bunch of big damage buffs in 11.1, so it should be carrying over a lot of its strength from Season 1. That brings us to our final melee predictions for the first week, Season 2. And keep in mind, this is just a prediction. Things were absolutely crazy last week, and we'll be making adjustments with every tuning pass. We do think that there are a few specs that are wildcards, including Ret Paladin, who didn't seem that great in the pre-patch. This could be due to some specs being absolutely busted, so we're going to hold off a bit before demoting them to the mid-tiers. And despite some lost PvP talents, we do think rogues are still carried by their survivability and control. Outlaws should continue to be one of the better specs in Solo Shuffle when played by a competent player. But with melee out of the way, let's check out all of the changes to range DPS this week. First up is Devastation Evoker, who is getting a rather irrelevant buff to a talent that's only used in PvE. Overall though, we think the fate of Dev Evoker is sort of tied to the balance of melee and any spec with spammable CC, especially mages and druids. Dev is typically good against melee since it can bully them into the dirt with infinite mobility. On the flip side, Devastation typically doesn't want to be cycloned or rooted, but with Cyclone lasting 1 second less and mages being bullied by Marks Hunters, we think Dev could have a really good start to the season. Speaking of Hunters, Beast Mastery is getting a 5% damage buff. Now before you completely freak out, this is offsetting an overall damage nerf they got in 11.1. But the real reason you might want to freak out is the fact that BM will soon have access to their 2 set, which is one of the strongest in the game, allowing them to passively keep up barb shot stacks. For those of you who don't know what that means, it simply translates to big damn. On the receiving end of some of that damage will be Mage. Luckily for Arcane, they will be getting some damage buffs to Missiles and Barrage, which are both good on paper, but remember that 11.1 basically made Ring of Fire unplayable, which made the single spell school problem even worse. Arcane will continue to be one of those specs with a super steep learning curve, with only a handful of players being capable of pushing it to the highest ratings. Both Fire and Frost Mage will be getting some anticipated nerfs to Overpowered Barrier. This PvP talent was actually insanely good for Fire, representing their #1 source of damage in some lobbies. At the end of the day, a mage is still a mage, and their toolkit will continue to carry. The only thing to be worried about, though, are the power level of Hunters and Shamans. With Marks and BM being one of the best range DPS, and Resto Shaman being one of the best healers, mages might have a rough time overall. Speaking of Shamans, Ellie is getting a 5% flat damage increase for week 1, which is just a drop in the bucket for what was lost in the patch. In case you forgot, Primordial Wave was completely redesigned in 11.1 and is now significantly worse, which is definitely not a good thing since it was literally the win condition for Elemental up until this point. We still think the spec will be good, but for Ellie to bounce back to the highest tiers, it will need some bigger damage buffs. And speaking of getting big damage buffs, Warlocks will be cooking this week. Demo is getting even more pet damage this week, and along with some quality of life changes with the 11.1 patch, we think it could be top dog. Although it could be a bit of a wild card, we could see Demo being exceptionally strong in the early season, especially after all the melee DPS nerfs. Demo tends to thrive in caster-heavy lobbies, and with a bunch of wizards getting buffed this week, Demo might be sleeper OP. Destro is where things get really interesting. Chaos Bolt, Infernals, and Wither are all getting significant damage buffs, to the point where Destro might be yet another sleeper OP spec for Season 2. Of course, the elephant in the room for any Warlock is always, well, Warriors. But with the nerfs to Arms and Fury, Warlock should be excited for games in Week 1. And that brings us to our updated range tier list for Season 2. And we know this might look a bit ridiculous, but keep in mind the first few weeks will be super chaotic. Although they didn't get any changes, we think Marks is now in an exceptionally good spot for the start of Season 2. With nerfs to Warriors and buffs to Casters, Marks Hunters should be retaining their crown as the Wizard Slayers. That brings us to Healers, which didn't get that many changes this week. Unfortunately for you Mistweaver mains, the fun in the sun might be over. Not only are Monks getting a 4% overall healing nerf, but Jade Empowerment is getting slashed in half. This was the Sith Lord Lightning heal, which was carrying Mistweavers in the pre-patch. A nerf did seem reasonable, but 50% might be a bit too punishing. So far this season, Monks already got nerfs to Mana Tea, Mastery, and their tier set, so this is just salt in the wound. At this point, it's a bit unclear where Mistweaver will land, but we don't expect them to be on the high tiers for the first week. But if there's one spec we do expect to stay on the high tiers, it's Disc Priest, who despite getting some damage nerfs to their Oracle tree, still should be one of the best healers in Season 2. Remember that Penance got Giga buffed in the patch, and now does 50% more damage and healing than in Season 1, while now automatically cleaving. And even though some people mourn the loss of Rapture, Evangelism is proving to be pretty good, especially when you can cancel Atonement on yourself in order to funnel more of its healing to your team. That brings us to our full healer tier list for Season 2, and once again, we'd like to remind you that this is a prediction after a week of complete chaos. Resto Shaman seems to have had a strong start in the preseason, and we expect some of this to carry over into Week 1. Thanks to a few key healing buffs in the patch, Shamans now have more flexibility to use all of their utility. We're honestly pretty surprised that Resto Druid didn't see any changes this week. Right now, it definitely feels like one of the worst healers, thanks in part to a very clunky new tree form, but it could be getting slightly better this week thanks to the tier set and the meta slowing down. On the flip side, Zen is super optimistic about Holy Priest. He thinks the spec has a lot of potential and could scale super well as the season goes on. To rank up fast this season, you need to check out our courses on how to counter every class in PvP. We've also got the best positioning guides on the internet, and our famous class courses which teach you how to master your spec. We take concepts and break them down into bite-sized pieces, kinda like quests, but instead of experience, you gain rating. We've also upgraded our UI in Season 2 with brand new features including in-game bislists, and now complete 2-in-1 hot swapping between PvP and PvE. As always, we're continuing to offer our rank up guarantee, where we literally promise you will gain rating by using our service. Be sure to click the link below to get started with an exclusive discount for Season 2. For now, we want to thank you all for watching. See you soon.